Hello, my friends and associates, fellow gaming gurus, experts, and wannabes. It's the Fat Man, the GM, wannabe, would be, could be, should have been, so on and so forth. You know, Rob Gusters, I've been doing some bits and pieces of the friendly playable races for standard fantasy RPGs. Some of these are older systems, mostly D&D and so on and so forth. And I'm sitting here wondering if that's my client showing up early. That would be nifty. I don't think so. They went next door. It's the advantages, disadvantages of my job. This morning I have one job at 9 a.m. I finished it. The next one's scheduled at 11. It's at a restaurant that's closed on Mondays, and I'm just waiting for the customers to arrive. Sometimes they come early, sometimes they don't. Either way, it is what it is. So we've covered elves, halflings, gnomes, and dwarves, your most common fantasy playable races. We purposely did not cover humans because, well, you know, we're human. We know how to play ourselves to some degree or another. That isn't to say that we are knowledgeable in putting our feet in other people's or other races' shoes to that aspect. So, you know, it's still some stretch of the imagination and role play involved if you're trying to play some diverse culture from humans. That's not what I'm here to discuss. I'm here to discuss the not so friendly playable races, specifically the humanoids. And I will lump in the half-orc into this category because I've always had a slight view of just exactly what a half anything is. I don't agree that they are an entity of a race unto themselves, or they wouldn't be half of something. So why not say half human as opposed to half orc? You don't hear of too many halflings. We hear plenty of half elves, not so many half dwarves for some reason or another, which I think is because it would just confuse people. You know, at the end of the day, a half a dwarf would be either a halfling or a human in a lot of people's mindset. Not saying that they would be or they wouldn't be. Now, at some point in the hierarchy of Dungeons and Dragons and here I'm having a brain fart. You know, when we talk about bringing a new set of mechanics and rules into play that supersede the old set, so the new versions, some point in the early to mid versions, we started to see this transition from specifically non-playable bad guy characters or creatures to the possibility of being a playable race. And that must have been because there were a lot of players at some point or another who dabbled in the idea of homebrewed monster races as playable characters, as playable race, for one reason or another. Whether they set out to create a campaign that's from the other side of the coin, or an evil campaign in some people's vernacular, or because they just really wanted to stretch. They played all the normal handful of friendly races that were available. It wasn't until later we saw the introduction of the neutral playable races to some degree, which I will put, you know, the tiefling being the most commonly known one in that. I don't remember what version the tiefling became playable, but I do know that in 3.5 it is a playable race. I don't remember tieflings even being in 2nd edition. I'm not saying that they weren't added at some later point. That was the advantage or disadvantage of that particular version, because as it was fondly or not so fondly called 2.0, was a very long-lived version. It went quite a ways between it and the introduction of what would become 3.5. So there was a 3.0, but it quickly transitioned to 3.5 when they tried to correct a bunch of glaring problems in a variety of different corners of that version. The 2nd edition also, as we know, 2.0. I'm sure some of you guys can tell me exactly how many years it ran, that will say that it didn't run any more or any less than some of the other versions, and they may be true. But I will argue that I have far more 2.0 material than I do 3.5 material, let alone seen 4.0 or 5.0 had. So there was a huge amount of material cranked out for second edition AD&D. And you can call them splat books, source books, whatever the heck you want to call them. I don't care. I just know there were a parcel of them, and I have quite a few. We're not even talking the worlds and the box sets and stuff that came out in tandem with second edition rules. So I noticed, at some point the Half-orc cropped up, and of course one of the less spoken sidebars of the Half-orc, and I've seen it mentioned a few times in other people's videos and on some discussions on the Brigade channel and other channels in the past year. It's just, how do we get a half an orc? Now, orcs generally considered a hostile, violent, destructive, argumentative force to be reckoned with. They are the uber mass bad guy. You can throw dozens of them at your player characters, and every one of them will mow them down without batting an eye and having no remorse doing so. And that was the intent for the monstrous or the monstrous humanoids that were created as foes from historical lore, myth, fantasy, what have you, to pit our player characters against, to give them some thinking, some logic, possibly logic-based, semi-intelligent or intelligent races to compete against, or to fight, where you have some more than just dumb beasts and magical animals and magical beasts going after it. So at some point somebody said, how do we end up with a half-orc? Well, I think I'm sorry, and I know he touched on it. I'll have to do some research and throw it into the comments, because I know his name, and he did a very cracked video on it. It was a topic of sex in RPGs to some degree. The orcs basically raped and pillaged a bunch of humans and ended up with the half-orc. So technically it's a sub-race of both the human and the orc kind, which in some vernacular, some stories, places them as less violent, less bloodthirsty, less animalistic than their orc forebears. But in the same venue, and I've had some people make some pretty reasonable, passable arguments to this effect, humanity in all of its glory is no less bloodthirsty, destructive, angry, murderous, intended-minded than any orc or goblin ever created, in the right context or the right society. We only have to look at our own human history to see that there were plenty of societies that had absolutely no value of human life that wasn't their tribe, and there you have that. So we get this melange of half-orcs where they're considered a goodly race with a bad taint. And so we can have villages and small towns of them and so on and so forth, and it's okay for you to have a player that plays one, because the real advantage is here is the player gets a beefed up human in some aspects. The player already has a tendency to play the shield, or play the assault player. They want strength and speed and constitution. They're not worried about looks and smarts. Well, the half-orc's right up their alley. It just gives them much more of a beefier human to play. And I see it crop up in some of the novels over the years to that degree, to a limited mindset, right? Where you don't find there's a whole lot of half-orcs inside of orc communities in general. They're usually driven out, or are wise and smart enough to understand that they can do much better than hanging out with their full-blooded relatives. There are some campaigns, there are some game modules and stuff that show orcish communities with half-orcs in them. I've known people to include them in player campaigns, and that's fine. I'm not going to argue one way or another. But that's why I think they belong in this other category. Plus, we've seen, and I know I've had one player who really liked to play Goblins because for some reason or another, they're just a really twisted, evil version of a halfling in their mind. And they just had so much fun with the character, and it's the absurdity of some of the character's actions. So we get these humanoids where you got hobgoblins, goblins, orcs, to some degrees gnolls, and ogres, who are actually considered a playable, if not less than friendly race. Now, I've always made the context is if you're going to play something that's out of the monster manual, that's considered a foe by most of the goodly races, in pretty much every campaign I run, you're going to have to suffer the consequences of that role. You're going to be the black sheep, so to speak, of that particular race. You're going to go against the conventions of what everybody else sees. So if you decide to play a gnoll or an orc or a goblin, and you roll into a human village, the odds are real good the human village are going to, the humans are going to freak. They're going to board themselves in, they're going to call out the militia or whatever the equivalent there is, and try to either kill you, do their level best to kill you, drive you out. Now, if you've got one of those world campaigns where everything is so diverse that it's common or somewhat, neo-common to find these not-so-friendly races intermingling with the friendly races in large communities or in trading locations or stuff, so be it. That is not the norm. That is not the norm. And if that is some sort of push for our social justice mindset today, to push our game systems to be that open-minded about everything, it starts to really affect the flavor and spirit of the game. Because then, by all intents and purposes, in the same venue that we should think twice about attacking the orc or the goblin or the gnoll or the ogre or what have you, then we should have less of qualms about attacking the other goodly races. So if we come across some elves and we want to take their stuff, we should have less of a moral dilemma of attacking them, because equal pay is equal play. I'm just saying, right? So if you want equal treatment, equal rights for everything, then that goes both directions. And I get a kick, or I get a rolling-eyed annoyance occasionally when I sign people who they want their cake and they want to eat it too, so to speak. Well, who buys a cake without intending to eat it, right? Unless you're giving it away as a gift. So, in that aspect, if you want to play something and you don't expect to be ostracized or picked on or threatened, or have to do a lot of fast talking to keep yourself from getting run out of town on a rail, or worse, on a spike, skewered on a spike, then you really shouldn't be surprised when it happens. What kind of game are you thinking this is going to be? Because maybe I'm just a little too old school when it comes to certain things. I think Mike made a point about that too. About a monster's a monster's a monster to some degree, and that's what they're for. If you want to play them, bring a different character sheet because you're not playing it. Just for simplicity's sake, simplicity. Just making it much more complicated than necessary. Unless that's your bag. You want a complicated, really moral dilemma oriented game, then knock yourself out. I'm not here to judge. I really am not here to judge that. So when I look at other players who tell me they want to play a goblin, or an orc, and I think, why would you want to do that? Or then I might think from the outside the box and say, okay, well, what if everybody played one? We'll just play a campaign from the viewpoint of the orc, where the orc's job is to somehow defend their territory against these terrible, wicked humans that are making these incursions and killing them on sight. So maybe they're in the eyes of the in the eyes of the terrorists are the good guys. So in the eyes of the orcs are doing their people and their kind the right by doing right by their kind by doing what they do. And the only way they understand that they feel that the other side gets the picture is to be over the top on everything they do. Okay, let's do a campaign that way. Not a problem. Now, when we see the disillusion, or the disbanding of the alignment side of things, we start making it easier to blend these friendly and not so friendly playable races together. And because in truth, most people have all the alignments at some point in their lifetime. At some point in the day, they feel awful evil, and sometimes they just want to go crazy, and other times they want to be by the book, and other times they want everybody to play nice, and then other times they just sit on the fence. They don't care one way or another as long as they're left alone, or there's a balance in their world. So having the predominantly one alignment has kind of always been a little cliche and a little misunderstood. Doing it with the monstrous humanoids makes it even more so, because by definition they're monstrous for a reason. They're just, otherwise they're just humanoids. If this was a sci-fi setting, now we have a completely set of different dynamics involved, which I find that to be an interesting thing, because I have played plenty of sci-fi settings where you had orcs in space, and the orcs were still an evil bad guy race. They were still the not so friendly playable race, and yet it had a bit more tolerance to their existence, as long as they weren't trying to burn down the spaceport. The local authorities weren't going to jump on them with both boots. But if the local communities suffered a number of raids from space-based orcish tribe or space-based orcish pirates, they're likely to land on them with both feet. But they wouldn't make any difference if it was a bunch of human pirates that have been raiding their community. They would do the same thing, right? So we got that apples and oranges and pears dilemma in there. Do you allow your players to reach and expand and to get into these races that were never really intended to be played as anything but a foe? Do you give the opportunity to give a new set of dynamics and dimension to these not so friendly playable races? I guess that's always been at the end of the day, one of those things where we have to make that decision as a GM and as a group of players. Everybody gets down in session 0 or the get together prior to gaming, and so we hammer out exactly, Joe wants to play a goblin. How are you guys okay with it, and how do you envision having acquired a friend such as Joe the Goblin? Good things to think of, good things to know. I mean, I have a number of books on the monstrous humanoids that give us a little bit of their culture and their background, and I got Merp give me some really detailed stuff for the orcs. Orcs are much more sophisticated and culturally driven than people first think. If they really want to look at it, the orcs potentially are the humans of the monstrous races. In their aspect, they're the most common, the most diverse, the most physically capable, and the most capable of running the range of classes. You can have an orc wizard, you can have an orc ranger. Shoot, you could even have an orc druid if you wanted to allow it. Just thought, as always, interested in commentary. What little I get of it, it's always good. Thank you very much.